Thanks to all of you here and to everybody watching from afar. My name is Carlos Diaz. I'm the founding director of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. And we have Tony. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tony Pereira. I'm the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. Happy to be here tonight.
And we're super excited to have the former president of the Republic of Ecuador, JAMIL MAHUAD, who's here with us. We're now going to spend time on his biography. Very impressive. He has been a legislator, he has been a mayor, he has been a minister, and of course, president of his country. We're going to talk about all sorts of issues, including his book, which, by the way, we try to get multiple copies to give to the students, and it was sold out. But we just discovered that a few copies have been found recently, so we're going to go see if we can get them right now over the next hour or so to give to the students. It's a great book. Thick, but full of great content. And so what I thought we would do is give the president 20 minutes or so to talk about the book, talk about his experience leading the Republic of Ecuador, and then Tony and I will pepper him with questions, and then you'll get a chance to ask him any questions you want. So if that's okay with you, then we'll start, Mr. President. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. I want to start saying thank you to Florida International University, to the Adam Smith Center, and to both of you that have been so kind to invite me today. We are here to talk about an economic policy in my country that divided the economy of Ecuador in two. People talk about before and after the dollarization of the economy. One result of that decision is that we have had an inflation rate of less than 10% for more than 20 years. Before that, we run inflations of 50, 70% annually. We just got the results for the inflation in the month of February, annualized, and we closed with 2.9%. So we have the second lowest inflation in Latin America. And it is more or less, it used to be half of the United States inflation. Can you imagine that for a Latin American country, as unstable as my country has been? Then we are experiencing one of the fastest growths of our economy since the year 2000. With Panama, which is another country that uses the dollar as a currency, they say we are not a dollarized country, we have a dollar-based economy. They make the distinction. And from the point of view of the workers, the minimum salary for Ecuadorians, $450, used to be the highest salary, meaning basic salary in Latin America. Now we are in the top 3 because, as you know, countries make decisions, so the salary changes. So, based on that, we have put the basis for middle class to get established. If you're on a poll now in Ecuador, as has been done in the last years, more than 90% of the population supports the dollar as the currency. They don't want to hear about changing the currency. So it is a successful story. And a successful story after 23 years, which is a time that allows you to make a kind of historical analysis of it. We did it for the first time in the world. Ecuador was the first country that dollarized the economy. Nobody had done that before. Some people say Panama, but remember when Panama got independent from Colombia, they started with the Balboa and the dollar at the same time. They did not sacrifice or kill the national currency. And 1 year after Ecuador, El Salvador dollarized the economy. In different circumstances, and probably that would be an interesting topic for the questions and answers part. Okay. Now, why we published this book? Based on your words, a good friend, the former president of Uruguay, Luis Alberto Lacalle, the father of the current president, used to joke saying that I sent him a pocket book because of the size and the weight. It is 1,100 pages. And the reason is that after 20 years of a good experience, many people have talked and have published articles about the dollarization, except the people, the group of persons that made the decision. So our voice, the actors of the process, had not been heard yet. And this is the first characteristic of this book. This has my personal story, how I understood the problem, how I faced the possible solutions, how did I choose this particular one. But we have the experiences from the superintendent of banks, the minister of finance, the member of the directory of the central bank, the Federal Reserve over there, the director of the juridical office in the presidency of the republic, because you have to change a lot of laws to make this thing happen. You have the opinion of the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who used to be the director of the second main important newspaper in Quito. And because of that, you have very different perspectives. It is like a mosaic. And you can read and go inside the different parts, depending on your interest about it. It has the prologue of Domingo Cavallo, who was the minister of Argentina, who put into place the convertibility in Argentina. He was my main advisor in this process. It has an article from Ricardo Hausmann, who was the chief economist of the International Development Bank at that time, who was an advisor for the presidency as well. So we have combined historical elements. If somebody is interested in that part, he or she could say, look how was Ecuador 23 years ago. It has analysis, of course. And we have chosen the literary genre of a memoir. This is not a political, welcome. This is not a political book in the sense of the typical State of the Union. In the State of the Union, you have to write the things, and very few people read about it. This is a memoir. We are telling the story from our guts. We are telling you what were the fears, the hopes, the difficulties that we went through. So it starts with the situation of the economy in our country. I had a problem there, because if you buy a book about the dollarization of Ecuador, as the title says, how can you understand that without the context? But few things are so heavy and boring as contexts. You start reading about all the elements, and after 3 pages you can say, come on, I wanted to know about the dollarization, and you close the book and leave it there. So how to give you the necessary context in a way that you will become interested in reading? That was a big challenge. And I've been teaching at Harvard for 23 years. And the thing I do is to invite the classroom, the students, to become my cabinet and to make decisions on my behalf with me present there. And I start giving them information chronological as I was receiving that information as president. With a warning, there's no free lunch. For anything you decide to do, you have to pay a price. Even for dollarization, you have to pay a price, of course. And you have to make the decision you think is the best for the country, not my decision, the decision you want to make. And then we discussed that in class. And I decided that to put that class into the book as an introduction allowed me to provide the context without boring the reader. That's the first part. Then, you have heard about The Perfect Storm. Have you seen the movie or read the book? Mm-hmm. No? Okay. The Perfect Storm is about a ship that departed from Gloucester near Boston and went fishing, and they had to face at least 3 big natural problems that destroyed the ship and were probably one of the worst moments in the history of these natural disasters. Because there was a hurricane coming from the Caribbean, you are familiarized with that here. Then you had a front cold coming from Canada. Then you have another front cold coming from the Great Lakes. Each one of those was strong enough to produce a tragedy. I remember watching the movie and seeing this meteorologist in front of the screen saying, happy. They are coming together at the same time to the same place. And that happens once in a century. Because if that happens, they feed each other. And that is the perfect storm. He was happy as a meteorologist to be able to study the phenomenon. Okay. So we had the perfect storm in the economy of Ecuador in 1998, 1999. The worst economic year probably in the century for my country. What were the elements of this storm? First, El Niño. 80% of the exports of Ecuador were 4 products: bananas, shrimp, fishery, and oil. El Niño destroyed the first 3. And the price of oil, the second element, went down to $7 per barrel. And in the national budget, it has been calculated before I became president to $14 per barrel. In other words, bless you. In other words, I didn't have money to pay salaries to the public servants. They were striking, coming to the streets. Nurses were not paid, teachers, the police was not paid. So what do you do in your private company or in a country when you have that kind of problem? You have a temporary problem. El Niño came and will go out, temporary. You go and get a loan, a bridge loan to overcome the problem. Well, at that very moment, we had the East Asia crisis, 1998. Remember, it affected Thailand, Indonesia, all those countries, Malaysia, and was the first crisis of the globalized economy. The difference with the crisis in 2008 is that it started in the third world, not in the developed world. But 2 things. First, nobody was in charge. Who will take care of the problems of globalization at that moment? We were not organized for that. And second, as Ecuador had a big external debt, and we have a reputation of not being a good payers, at that very moment, all the markets were closed. So we couldn't get this loan, this bridge. And what do you do in those moments? You go to the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund. Everybody does that. However, at that time, the thinking, the prevalent thinking at the IMF was one size fits all. It doesn't matter if it is Russia, actually happened with President Yeltsin, or Ecuador, or any place in the world. You have to follow the Washington consensus, meaning reduce the size of the government, open your economy, and behave in a democratic way. And if you do those things, that was the mantra, repeated intermittently, you will be happy and you will have a bright future. That never happened, as we know. But that was the thinking of the moment. So we couldn't produce in that moment in my country. Everybody was angry. How can you raise taxes in a country in that moment? Which parliament will raise taxes when the people is suffering? They never like to raise taxes by principle, but in that circumstance, it's even worse. So we couldn't produce the reforms that the IMF was asking for. So we did everything by the book. What do you do when you are not exporting, you have no dollars, and you have to import more because you have to import even things that you produce locally because those things were destroyed by El Niño? What happens when your supply goes down and your demand increases? The price of the good goes up. And we are talking about the price of the dollar now. So the depreciation, the devaluation was enormous. And what does a country do in those circumstances? And we were going by the book with the advice of the IMF and the World Bank and the very good economists we had in our government. First, allow the depreciation to work. Second, I have to convince you to keep your investments in sucres. You are afraid because you are losing money because of the depreciation. So I will pay you an interest rate so high that even in the worst possible depreciation, it is a good idea to stay in sucres. The interest rates would be higher than the depreciation. The interest rates were up to 330%. And people were still thinking that the depreciation could be higher than that. Why? This is my way of understanding things. All the traditional economy is based on the principle that we are rational actors. So if you produce the right incentives, people will make the right decisions. However, what happens when people enter into panic? Are we rational actors still? We make rational decisions with the front part of our brain, with the front lobe. And now neuroscience has proved that. The moment you are scared or in panic, if you took an MRI of that person, you follow the flow of the blood with an MRI. Because the blood brings the oxygen that activates the neurons that allow the neurons to work. Well, if you're in panic, there's no blood coming to the front lobe. So literally, look at the phrases we human beings have created to say that. You lose your head, we say. You are out of your brain. You are not thinking. Well, that is true. It's physiologically impossible to think in those moments. So all the right incentives do not work. What do you do in those circumstances? So I knew we couldn't do more of the same. The rising interest rates, the devaluation in the currency, etc., were not working anymore as a solution. We needed a paradigm shift. We needed to think in a different way. There are two kinds of knots. The typical knot you can untie with some skill and some patience. But if you have a Gordian knot from ancient Greek, a knot that was constructed in such a way that every time you try to untie, you tie it stronger. Alejandro the Great came, according to the legend, took his sword and said, it is the same to untie than to cut. And he cut the Gordian knot. So that was my conclusion. We need to do something different. We need to cut this problem, and the only way to do it is by adopting the dollar as the currency of Ecuador. Usually the anchor is the monetary policy. You can control that by what is doing the Federal Reserve right now to try to control the inflation here? The emission of money, well, it was not much of in Ecuador there. You can try to anchor the economy through the fiscal policy. For a technical reason, it was not possible again. So the only possible way was with the exchange rate policy. And that's what we did. Okay, so we did everything in the best logical way. We researched what was going in the world. Conclusion, nobody has done that before. Bad news, we would have loved to learn from somebody else. Second, get the best possible advice. Then there came Domingo Cavallo. The convertibility in Argentina was the closest example to Ecuador. Then we needed a good team of doctors to perform this operation. And we had a very good team in the government. They had PhDs from very good universities in the world. They had experience in the public sector, which is not the same than the private sector. And we decided to do it. Dollarization, I will close with this to open for conversation. I defined a good public policy as a table with 3 legs. A sustainable public policy needs a technical leg. It depends on the matter. In this case, economics. What are your reserves in the central bank? How much do you have as sucres circulating in the economy, etc. Technical work. Second, what I call the CUCO test. Q for cultural, CO for compatibility test. The cultural compatibility test. Any sustainable policy is a policy that is accepted and lived by the population. It's very difficult to do something against the trend and be successful. Well, the economy of Ecuador was unofficially dollarized around 70%. You were hiring people, you were buying goods, you were renting goods in dollars. And a lot of remittances from immigrants. So even poor people received dollars from abroad and were training how to deal with that. Not in rural sectors, but in cities they could do that. So that's the second leg, the CUCO test, cultural compatible with the country. And the third leg, politically viable. You need to reform such enormous amount of laws to change all the framework that without the political, Ecuador is not a country for coalitions. We hate coalitions in politics, and that's part of our tragedy. But at least some kind of agreement, at least temporary. Without those 3 things, you cannot succeed. So the moment we got a politically viable proposition, we decided to dollarize. 23 years later, it has been a success. This morning I got, it's so interesting. There's a debate in Argentina right now about what to do with the economy. One of the candidates is Javier Milei, and he's saying, I will dollarize the economy. And if they don't allow me to do it, I will call for a plebiscite, and the Argentinian people will vote yes. This is a big conversation. I'm just mentioning what he's saying. Second, I got news from Lebanon. You know, we are talking about the 3 countries in the world with the highest inflation now, which are Venezuela, Argentina, and Lebanon. And they are talking about the possibility of having a hard currency over there. And third, the Venezuelan economy. They are not officially dollarized, but they have implemented mechanisms, so they use the dollar in many different ways. And the inflation is still high. It is in the hundreds, but before, it was in the thousands. So even though it is not completely done, it is working. So sorry, I wanted to make just this introduction, and very happy to have an interchange of opinions or comments with you.
Thank you, Mr. President. So now we'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony, do you want to take the first one?
Yes, Mr. President, this is a really fascinating presentation. I'd love to be a student in your class, given the information and trying to make the same decisions. But I wanted to ask you something about how we think of the costs of dollarization, because I think the conventional way of thinking about it is that it's got short-term concentrated costs that hit people really hard. You know, their accounts are frozen and so on. But the long-term collective benefits, eventually they're going to outweigh the short-term costs. And my question is, could there be long-term collective costs if, for example, and this came up in the Euro crisis in Europe, where the southern European countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain were saying, when we have a currency like the euro that's dominated by countries with high costs of labor and high incomes and high standards of living, this is bad for our exporters because we get stuck. So the importers like it because they've got a strong currency to import with, but the exporters often don't like that kind of arrangement because they become uncompetitive. The cost denominated in dollars of their exports look too expensive compared to what they were before when the national currency was being used. So my question is, the stability seems a fantastic argument on your side in the sense of low inflation, stability, people can calculate the future costs and so on, which is a huge, I don't think you can underestimate psychologically that relief that people feel if they've been going through hyperinflation and then they get to stability. I saw it in Brazil after the Plano Real. So that's huge, and it helps the poor especially. But is there a long-term cost of dollarizing the economy? And if there is one, how do we calculate it? Because it's kind of a counterfactual. In other words, if you had been able to stabilize retaining a national currency, would you have had, for example, a richer export profile than the one you just described, which is basically primary products, right? It's fisheries, shrimp, bananas, and petroleum. So I mean, how would you respond to that? I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not an economist, so I'm not convinced about that argument. But I'm just wondering, how would you respond to a skeptic who raised that argument about what dollarization, the overall cost to the economy of dollarization?
Thank you, Tony. And your question really touches the main debate in Ecuador when we had to decide that. You're touching all the points. That is how good the question is. The main question in Ecuador was, is this convenient for the country? And the voices were divided. Some people said yes. The majority said no. Okay. Second, we knew that we were going to have some costs. And the European Union was one of the examples. Think about how well they prepared converting everything to the euro. They had time, they had organization, they have the best possible brains thinking about it. However, they had to pay prices. And one of the prices was, how do you say, el redondeo, we say in Espanol, meaning all the prices go up.
Yeah. Round up.
Round up,
yeah.
Okay. So even in Europe, they pay that. So we were going to face that. And second, we have repressed inflation. If you have a depreciation of the currency now, probably in 4 months you will see that effect. So we were going to have that dollarizing or not dollarizing the economy. That wave, that tsunami of prices were coming to us. So we paid that price in the first year. We had a very high inflation in dollars, not in sucres. However, after the second year, everything came down, okay? The other point, you mentioned that as well, Tony, was about exports. To make it simple, if we export bananas, and Colombia, our neighbor, exports bananas, Who is going to sell more bananas in the world? You can argue about quality, and our quality is superb in Ecuador. But you have to argue about the price as well. So if you devalue your currency, if you're an exporter, you receive dollars, and as you sell the dollars in the country, you receive more sucres for each dollar. And you pay salaries, especially, and many other things in sucres. So you are paying with devalued sucres, and you are receiving dollars. It's very good for the exporters, because they are making more money. So do not dollarize because your exports will be affected. That's the,
yeah.
And it is intuitive. It is true. Now, precisely Alfredo Arizaga, he was the Minister of Finance of Ecuador when we dollarized, just published an article, and he does this. He took 3 different countries. It's very difficult to compare because what do you compare with what? It's very difficult. So he took Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru with 3 completely different currency exchange rate regimes. Colombia has a very active central bank, and they have done that for decades. They are very disciplined, very rational. It doesn't matter who is in the presidency. The central bank is very well respected, but they actively depreciate the currency to benefit the exports. Peru is in the middle. They are praised all over the world because of the stability of the central bank, etc. And Ecuador is in the opposite. We cannot do that. We have the dollar, and we cannot do anything with the dollar. Okay? Well, what are the results of the exports since the year 2000 today? If I ask you what is the country that would be exporting more according to this principle?
The one that devalues.
Colombia, right? Yeah, they have the instruments. Well, the exports that have grown more are the Ecuadorian exports. Counterintuitive. And to make it even more hard, we took out all the minerals, oil, etc. We are talking just about the typical and the new exports. To give you a sense, the GDP of Ecuador at that time was 20 billion. Now is more than 100 billion. 5 times more. And Ecuador has now a record in the currency reserves in the central bank for at least a decade. So we have a lot of instability in the political field, but the economy has been stable. We had a president that hated dollarization, President Correa. He was a socialist, first thing. He was in power 10 years, second thing. And he changed everything that he wanted in the country.
Except dollarization.
Except dollarization. So he blamed dollarization almost every single day, saying we are not independent, where is our sovereignty, we cannot govern because we cannot manage that. So this man that changed constitutions, etc., why did not change the dollar? He had the power, because only the dollar was more popular than him. When he had the international price of the oil was $140 per barrel. 140, I had at 7. Okay? So they could produce all the social benefits and say, I love you seriously. The others didn't love you, my people. That's why I give you the money. No. And he didn't have the money because he did a great job economically. It was because of the price of the dollar, of the oil. And our incidence in the price of oil is the same that we have as an incidence in the Halley comet. Nothing, 0. It happens in the markets. It is terrible for Ecuador because we are Oil is clue for us, it's crucial, but we are small producers in the international market. So we don't play any game there. Different in bananas, different in shrimps, we play roles there.
You dominate.
Okay,
yeah.
so I think I covered the two questions.
Yes,
First,
yes.
the long-term exports with Alfredo Arizaga's article, and second, the short-term costs, the inflation, etc.
Okay. Carlos,
Sure. You mentioned political instability. Latin America is a region that is known for its political instability. And within Latin America, Ecuador is particularly unstable. In one decade, you had 8 presidents. You were one of them. And then you had, for the next decade, 1 president. A president that had all sorts of issues, as we've talked about, but that brought tremendous stability for the country. And now we're seeing, perhaps, a return to instability. It's not clear if the president will finish his term. Hopefully he will. So a two-part question. The first one is, how could President Correa bring that stability to the country despite his policies? And B, are we seeing a return to instability in Ecuador? And if so, why?
Okay. I think we are assuming that presidents bring or do not bring stability.
And they don't? Tell me more.
Yes, I do not agree with the assumption, okay? Let me put this in the Latin American context. Between 1997 and 2002, 9 presidents in Latin America couldn't finish their terms. I'm talking about Fujimori in Peru in the 3rd election, De la Rúa in Argentina, Sánchez de Lozada and Mesa in Bolivia, Aristide in Haiti. We, as generals, as Ecuadorians are, contributed with 3. President Bucaram, myself, and Gutierrez. Even President Chavez was deposed, and then he found a way to come back.
Yeah.
So all over the continent, this was happening. I used to say, if you are a medical doctor, and you say there are 10 traditional countries in South America, and you have 9 presidents deposed, I'm taking one from Haiti, but for making the argument, it is okay. You would say, this is a pandemic. Too many cases compared to the sample, to the universe. So why? And the only common problem, maybe with one exception to confirm the rule, was economic crisis. It's the economy, stupid. It's James Carville and Stephanopoulos' advice to President Clinton when he was a candidate. So a lot of instability. Then from the year 2000, and you can go practically to the end of the decade, you have only 2 presidents that didn't finish their terms. One president in Paraguay, President Lugo, and one president in Honduras. So why the change? Because politicians became responsible, intelligent, honest, organized? No. Because there was a country that appeared in the radar, and they started buying all of our exports, whatever we produce in Latin America, at very high prices. And the name is China. China became an actor. So with economies of all the region really blooming, you can become a good president. You know, Larry Summers used to say, who is a good Minister of Finance? And he was the Secretary of the Treasury. He says, it's the person that comes just in the right moment when things start to go well, and leave just in the right moment when things are going to go down. So in those circumstances, just make the case of oil at $140 in the world. You can become a better president. President Correa received more money than the rest of the presidents combined in Ecuador. And the question is very important. I found 4 reasons why the socialists of the 21st century were so successful in the sense of being there, staying there, and some of them are still there. We believe in one vote, one person. Some of them in Venezuela, Nicaragua, hope Bolivia will not go in that way, is one vote, one person, one time. The moment they win the election, they nail themselves to the seat, and how do you move them afterwards, okay? So the 4 reasons why you can be stable are: first, the atmosphere. When you have poverty, inequality, frustration, people are suffering. They are ready to listen to any promise to bring them out of that situation. We create that situation. It's a big part of our responsibility as societies. So you have the situation. Then you have a good communicator, and some of them were great communicators. Third, you have the simplification of the reality. Why you are poor? You can say, because the structure of the society produces that result, we need to change ABC. Or you can say something much simpler. You are poor because he is rich. You are poor because he is exploiting you. The class struggle, basis of the Marxism. So if you are poor, and they repeat that 24 hours a day for months or years, and you are poor, what do you have to do to leave poverty behind? Go against him, because he is the cause of your poverty. So they polarize the societies. They create big breaches even in families, and they get benefits of that. And the fourth, because we have had populists always in Latin America. They are not the first, the 21st century socialists. Why the populists behind were not successful? Because now they have money, because of the commodities, the prices. Now they can put the money where the mouth is for the first time. So believe me, I love you, I take care of you. Here's the money, here are the scholarships, here are the subsidies, here are the bonuses. The others didn't give you that. And you can see that, it is true. It is true, but the explanation you can have in this hall, it's very difficult to have that at the street level, okay?
If I can push back a little bit on that.
Yes, sure.
That suggests that leadership has a very limited role, right? That if the circumstances are right, then the role of the leader is sort of minimized.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? Do you agree with that?
Or we have to re-elaborate the concept of leadership and re-elaborate the role of a leader. I strongly believe that leaders are completely necessary for things to happen. Institutions are necessary for the things that happened will be there, stabilized. Let me give you this example. Decades ago, a man was here in Florida in a car, and somebody came and shot him, killed 2 people, I think, that were in the car. This person survived. Now, decades ago, one man was in New York. He was from England, was crossing the street, looked to the wrong side of the street, didn't see a car coming. The car hit him. He went to the hospital, was very, very affected, but then he recovered. The name of the first person is Franklin Roosevelt. The name of the second person is Winston Churchill. What have happened if they would have died? We don't know, but probably the things that happened wouldn't have happened as they happened. So that's the importance of the leaders. Yes. But I would say we have the tendency to see the leaders as savers, messiahs. And Ortega y Gasset said, I am I and my circumstances. You cannot understand anybody's life without considering the circumstances. So both are necessary. In good times, even regular, mediocre, people can do a good job. In difficult circumstances, you need to be really good to produce some results. That would be my reframing, if you allow me.
Mm-hmm. Tony, you have another question?
Yeah, President Mawad, I really enjoyed your description of policies having to have a technical component, a cultural compatibility component, and a sort of political viability component, those three things. And because the technical, it sounds like it's very much, you use the medical metaphor. You know, you have to have the right doctors who know the right cure. But on the political side, can I infer from that comment that because the armed forces in Ecuador are so politically important that you felt it necessary to consult them about the dollarization, or did you not?
I did not.
Okay.
And the armed forces in Ecuador for many, many years have played a very institutional role. They mostly are supporting the elected government.
Constitutional
Yes.
government. Yeah.
And I would say all over South America at least. Sometimes in Central America, decades ago, it used to be different. One more thing. We dollarized without talking with the United States. And that was based on maybe ignorance is the word. We were not aware that we should have done that because as the economy was already dollarized, we assumed that could continue. El Salvador, who dollarized 1 year later, did that talking with the Treasury, and 1 year afterwards, the IMF supported El Salvador, but the IMF was not with Ecuador when we decided. So
it was quite closed group, very small group that decided
yes.
on dollarization.
And recently, a friend of mine in Boston, his name is Dan, gave me a great example to explain dollarization in maybe easier terms. He went to the doctor and said, I am feeling dizzy and nauseous and unstable and bloated. I have problems with my liver, so change the medicine. And the doctor said, we have been dealing with that for many years with medicines and diet and exercise. It cannot be dealt anymore in that way. Your liver cannot function anymore. The only solution for you is a liver transplant. And to get a successful liver transplant, we come to the three elements again. You need, first, a technical decision. You need to be correct in your diagnosis. Second, you need the consent of the patient. How do you change the liver without the form signed? So the cultural compatibility kind, but in this case applied to one person. And then you have the political viability, meaning you need a team of doctors, a team. You need the anesthesiologist, the expert in the heart, the expert in the liver. You need the expert in autoimmune things because your body can reject the liver. You need to know that you will have crisis. Dan had septicemia. He got all the problems in the hospital. And he had 2 cardiac arrests. But the team was ready to deal with that. They knew that could come. And thank God we had that kind of team in Ecuador. Actually, just a question. Imagine that you are in charge of the central bank. And you have, when you dollarize, you are telling the people, bring all your sucres. I will buy your sucres and I will pay you in dollars. That's it. The big movements are just accounting changes. Change sucres for dollars in the accounting. But you have to collect the sucres in the streets. How do you do that? In an organized way, in a timely way, etc. So this great Ecuadorian, Miguel Dávila, who died the day the book was published because of COVID. And we owe him in Ecuador the success of that part of the dollarization. First, we decided that we needed a kind of distribution, the best network of distribution in the country for the people. And that was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola had points all over the country. So we used the small shops where they were selling Coca-Cola. And the team of the central bank went there. And the owner of the shop said, they are coming, come to here to learn. So they received explanation about this. And in the next visit, they brought the dollars and they brought the sucres, and we have the interchange at that level. So 9 months after that, everything was finished. Look at this detail. The second big question, besides is this good or bad for the country, was at what rate do you dollarize? How many sucres per dollar? And that's a big, big bet, because you have the best minds in macroeconomics coming to different conclusions. Why? I found this analogy. Imagine you are organizing a wedding in your family, and you have sent 250 invitations to the wedding. And the father says, okay, what is the size of the
reception?
No, la torta de novia.
Oh, cake.
The wedding cake. He says, 250 people we have invited, each one is allowed to have this piece of cake. So 250 times this piece of cake, we have the size of the cake. Then the mother comes and says, I have talked with people that organizes weddings, and they said that statistically, 80% of the invitees come to the wedding. So 80%, you will have 200 people, multiplied by this size, you have a shorter cake and will be enough. You want everybody to eat that piece, and you don't want to have remainings of the cake. And then comes the bride and says, okay, but in that list of 250 people, we have many friends and relatives that live abroad. They will not come to my wedding. They don't have the means or the time or the opportunity. So I think that 60% will come. So you will have only the sizes for 200 people. Sorry, for
150.
108, yes, 108. So who is right? You never know until the moment you count the heads in the reception. It is the same. The cake is the amount of reserves of dollars in the central bank. And the invitees are the people that will bring the sucres to be exchanged. And the Central Bank of Ecuador, who was against the dollarization, and they had the information, the basic information, said, you cannot dollarize with less than 4,000 sucres per dollar. And that meant depreciation of, it was at 25, 28,000. Imagine to go to 40,000. So after 9 months, counting the heads, all the money exchanged, $11 million were left in the central bank. Those were the remainings of the cake. Had we done at a lower price, we would have go to the worst possible scenario. You bring your sucres, and I have to say, I'm sorry. I don't have any more dollars to buy your sucres. Terrible, a disaster. Or if you go up, you will be making the people to pay prices because you will have the remaining of the cake to hike that you don't want.
Ask one more question and then I'll open it up for all of you. We have talked a lot about dollarization, right? It's the main topic of the conference today. It's the main topic of your book and one of your biggest legacies. But there's another legacy that I think is really, really important that we haven't talked about, and that is making peace with Peru. Latin America is a very unstable region, as we talked about, but it's also a fairly peaceful region. What many people don't know is that Peru and Ecuador were in a war with one another for decades, and not just a Cold War, a hot war with actual fighting, until you and President Fujimori signed a peace agreement. Can you talk a little bit about the process of getting to peace and negotiating that peace agreement?
Sure, Carlos, thank you. I was going to the airport in Quito to take a plane to go to Bogota to the inauguration of President Andrés Pastrana. 4 days before my inauguration as president. My cell phone rang. It was the Minister of Defense that I had appointed, saying, Mr. President, the armed forces want an urgent meeting with you. I said, okay, I am coming back tomorrow. Let's have the meeting tomorrow. And he said, Mr. President, sorry for insisting, but it is urgent. It is a matter of national security. We need to talk to you. That's a call you never want to receive. You don't want national security, urgency, Minister of Defense in the same paragraph. That's by definition bad news. So I said, okay, let's meet at the airport. I cannot stay, you know, in this protocol. You have a slot. You have to depart from your country and arrive in this slot to the other country because the next president is coming after you. So you have to be courteous and organized. They came, and in a place like this, in the Quito airport, they opened these portable maps that I have seen before in the movies, and they showed 12 places in our common frontier with Peru, where the soldiers were shaking hands, saying Buenos dias, and then putting their arms between them. And they told me that the Ecuadorian intelligence have discovered Peruvian plans to invade Ecuador 4 days after my inauguration. I said, okay, thank you. And I knew President Fujimori was coming to Bogota. So I thought we would have the chance to say, hi, I am JAMIL. We never met before. And maybe to build the first step to a relationship, to be able to use a phone call before shelling each other in 4 days. Of course, the intelligence can be wrong. Of course, you can ignore it at your own peril. Who are you to think that what the intelligence of your country is saying is not as good as your own criteria, if you are not in office yet? Arrived to Bogota, went to the hotel, and being there, I turned on the TV, and there was a voice saying, quote unquote, and President Fujimori has canceled his trip to Bogota and will remain in Peru to command the troops. And then it was a flash. It was repeated after 5 minutes. So I went out of my room, knocked the door of the president. I was elected, but he was the president, and invited President Alarcón to come and watch this with me. It was just voice. And we discovered it was the voice of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Peru, and the station that was broadcasting that was a Peruvian station. I told him, he is commanding the troops, and we are here for cocktail parties. What do we do, he said. And in a moment of black humor, I said, I don't know, you are the president. Of course, it was just black humor. Because if we would have gone back to Ecuador at that moment, just landed and then back, what are the message? What is the message for the world? War. War again, because as you said, that was happening. So we decided to stay and went back to the country. And then President Fujimori canceled his trip to my inauguration. So just link the dots. We were sacrificing any possible meeting to start the conversation. In my inaugural speech, I invited him to negotiate and find a treaty. Before the moment I went to the presidential palace from our parliament, I asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the best diplomat in Ecuador, Jose Ayala Lasso, what was the reaction of Peru? And he told me, let me tell you after the ceremony here. I don't want to ruin your first hour in office. Mm-hmm. Actually, what happened, as I learned a few hours later, it was not Fujimori who responded as a courtesy, president to president. It was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he said, what happens is that this president, referring to me, is so young, he doesn't know that everything between our countries was resolved in Rio de Janeiro, and we signed a treaty in Rio de Janeiro. For Ecuadorians, this is something we know by detail, but internationally, maybe not. So I extended my hand, and they did not reciprocate. Then, 3 days later, I received a call from the president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And he said, why don't you come to Paraguay tomorrow? Because President Fujimori is going there to the inauguration of the president of Paraguay. 3 presidents in Latin America in 1 week, Colombia, Ecuador, and Paraguay at that time. And I said, my vice president is already there. Paraguay is far away. It's not a big commercial partner of Ecuador. If the president and the vice president of my country are going to Paraguay in the first week in office, when the problems of the people are the economy, not Peru for the majority of the population, they will think we don't have the right criteria here. Both of us there. And he said, and on top of that, if Fujimori changes his mind, as he didn't come to Bogota, he doesn't want to talk with me over there. That will be terrible, very difficult to explain to my own people. And suddenly I got an idea. Why don't you meaning the Rio Protocol, Rio de Janeiro Protocol, has 4 guarantors. The United States, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. So the big gorillas of the tribe of gorillas of Latin America. If you invite us, both of us, we will have a talk. So imagine the problem for Fernando Henrique. He could call President Menem, Argentina, President Frey in Chile. He needed to talk with the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Thank God he's a very close friend with Bill Clinton until today. So he called and President Clinton got the call. And he accepted. So at that night, at that afternoon, I called for a press conference and tell I am going to Asunción tonight. And I'm going to talk with President Fujimori. Landed there around 4 a.m., time for a couple of hours of sleep, take a shower, and go to the ceremony. And then a few hours later, in the suite of President Menem, because we were all of us were in the same hotel, different floors. But we couldn't go to the Peruvian territory, or he couldn't come to the Ecuadorian territory. Those were the sensitivities at that time. We went to neutral territory, Argentinian floor. And we have our first meeting. So that's how it started. And thank God, 77 days later, we signed the peace treaty. But I built on what had been constructed by my predecessors. I recognized all that work not trying to invent the world and thinking that everything started with me, like if I would be Aiden. No, you have to build on the previous things.
So leadership matters. All right, questions from the audience? If we can begin with the students, right here.
Well, I'm actually a student.
That's fine, go ahead.
Okay. So, well, thank you for coming today. It's an incredible honor to hear your perspective. You know, I'm from Venezuela. I was a political activist there. I suffered persecution. And as you said, a lot of people right now are discussing the possibility of dollarizing the economy of Venezuela. And I want to know what do you think? Do you think it's possible to do it regardless of all of the sanctions that we see against the Venezuelan economy? Do you think that's a possibility? And also, I wanted to know, I think you already touched on that point briefly, what's the coordination between Ecuador and probably the Federal Reserve? I think you already mentioned that there was none. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, for future questions, feel free to ask in English or in Spanish.
Thank you. Well, the first thing is that I have seen a change in the foreign policy of the United States vis-a-vis Venezuela, is my feeling. They are much more open to talk with the regime over there. So if they are talking about other issues, they could talk about the dollar. That's the first thing. And that includes dealing with the sanctions as well. Second, as this is working in the real world, maybe it is in the interest of many, many people to stabilize that situation fast and in the best way. So they are doing that in practical terms. Maybe they need to do that in legal terms. So I would not close that door.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
I kind of have a similar question. First of all, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to talk with you. My name is Luciano. I'm from Argentina. And when you were talking, I cannot help but to think that is there such a similar situation with a drought going on in Argentina? Then there's also a huge worldwide economic crisis with the war. Then Argentina may also have the bad reputation about debt that Ecuador used to have. And we also recruit to the International Monetary Fund. So do you think that Argentina could learn from the experience of what happened with Ecuador to dollarize the economy? And do you think that would be a good thing to do?
Thank you, Luciano. The first thing is this. With such a good experience, in my case and my country, with the dollar, why I do not preach dollarization across the board? It's like natural. I do not. Because I think you have to study case by case the situation. The second lessons I have learned is that only when you are almost desperate, you can take desperate decisions. There are decisions that are good, but if you don't have the water here, you find ways to postpone, to try to dodge the issue, etc. A big question I am following your country very closely. A big question I have read and heard on the networks is what would be the inflation rate when the government will finish. Because you ended with 94%, which is enormous. So that is the question. Now, there are other options. In the last important international meeting in Buenos Aires, a president of Argentina announced the possibility of having a common currency with Brazil, which sounds interesting, to the two biggest economies in South America together. Then they qualified the announcement. It's just for commercial things, etc. It is not for the daily transactions. And the reactions from the world were very dismissive about that idea. Some others are thinking about the Peruvian system, beam monetarism, have two currencies. So my suggestion, with all due respects, Carlos used to ask me, what is your advice? And I remember Atahualpa Yupanqui, he says, let's say in español, nadie puede dar consejos no hay hombre que sea tan viejo. Okay? So it is not an advice. It is just a thought. Do the job. Do the homework. Analyze the technical leg. Be sure that you have the reserves, enough reserves. But here, there is a very important point. Again, we have to credit Miguel Davila with this. When you calculate the size of the cake, you have to know how many people will bring with them sucres or the pesos. Now, he knew the balance of the central bank very well. Let me give you just one example. He said, look at this institution. The INFA, el Instituto Nacional del Niño y la Familia, usually presided by the First Lady. And they had a balance here. So they will come to change that balance for dollars. And he said, I have observed that this number hasn't moved for many years. So most surely they will not do it. If you do that item by item, you can come with a with a smaller pie cake. And maybe you need less dollars in the central bank. So that technical part is absolutely essential to make a right decision. I hope they do the homework. I hope they think rationally and rigorously about that.
Great.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. You said that...
Name? Where are you from?
I'm from Ecuador. Same city as Mr. President.
Wow.
Well, you said that we tend to see leaders as the reason for success. We tend to see leaders as the reason for success. But in reality, number one reason is timing. And well, it turns out that today here in Star FIU, the place we're here now, I learned that timing is the number one most influential factor for business success. The number one being the leader and execution. With that in mind, what you said were the factors that determine timing, that it was time to change the dollars in Ecuador.
The Dan's liver example. If your liver is not working anymore, you have to imagine something different. The liver was working before timing, and you could control with medicine. The paradigm shift means you have to think differently. You have to invent something that has not been there before. There's a beautiful quote from Robert Kennedy. He says, some people look at things as they are, and they think, why? I like to think about the things that can be, and I ask, why not? So that's the attitude. And that's what you are doing in your startups here. I had little of information this afternoon about it. So the timing comes from the circumstances. And probably you can have a big debate about that. But you need somebody to make a decision. I quote actors. You were saying to me something that brought to my mind Peter Drucker. He's the guru of the business sector. And he came studying the economies in Japan at that time, when Japan was the rising star in the world. He found something philosophical, I would say, that in Eastern societies, when they have a problem, they spend 80% of the time analyzing the problem, and 20% of the time trying to find the solution to the problem. Because when you come to the same description of the problem, the solution is almost evident. In Western societies, we do the opposite. We use 20% of the time analyzing the problem and 80% of the time trying to sell the solutions. And that's why we are butting our heads, because everybody has a different map of the reality in his or her mind. Okay? So that's a good way to proceed. And you told me that you are doing that here. First, describing the problem. That's a very good start. And then the timing is very debatable.
All right. Questions? Go for it.
Hi, Mr. President. My name is Manuel Escobio. I'm in the financial sector.
Could you speak a little bit louder, please?
Yes, my name is Manuel Escobio. I'm in the financial sector,
Uh-huh.
the international side. And we've studied a lot of different options when it comes to dollarization, including the gold standard. I was wondering, you've obviously exhausted almost everything, right? You've raised interest rates to astronomical levels. Did you ever consider a different system that perhaps was in full dollarization, especially without the consent of the U.S. Treasury? Did you consider anything else where perhaps you kept a lot of the monetary control over the interest rates, over the amount of currency in circulation? Did you consider anything else apart from dollarization?
Actually, first we tried to make the system work as it was. No? Second, came to the idea of why not to implement the convertibility instead of the dollarization, meaning keeping the two currencies.
Like in Argentina.
Like in Argentina. At that time, the convertibility in Argentina was working pretty well. Later, we had a problem in 2001, but it was 99. What is the problem? Argentina said, we have a peso, dollar, 1 peso per $1. And people believed that, the cultural compatibility test. They believed in that. In Ecuador at that moment, if you would have said, let's keep the sucre with the dollar, nobody wanted the sucre anymore. It was like a hot potato. You received your salary, and because of higher inflation, you run to exchange your salary for something. Give me dollars, give me a ticket, give me food, give me something, anything. But I don't want this hot potato in my hands. So that was another thing that we considered, but we understood that for our culture, that was not an option. And the other option, people said, why the dollar? And this is something you are talking in Argentina, right? Why not a basket of currencies? Well, that comes to our situation. Geographically, historically, we are, at that time, not now, I don't know in the future, but the main partner, commercial partner, was the United States. Now, China is growing exponentially. So, if we are in the dollar realm, and we are transacting in dollars, and the population naturally, when they want to save, they save in dollars, why do you go against that current? So that's why we have chosen the dollar. Now, in other countries, they can consider other currencies. So those were the options that we had in mind.
All right. Let's do 2 more questions. 1 and 2. Go for it.
Louder, please.
Patricio Rivera es el actual asesor de Venezuela en finanzas.
I have heard that. I have heard that.
Mi primera pregunta es, ¿cómo hacer con la poca flexibilidad del sistema cuando se dolariza debido a la liquidez cuando hay una crisis financiera? Y parte de la pregunta sería, ¿cómo hacer con la capacidad también de endeudamiento?
Yeah. It's very provocative, the first affirmation that you made, because I have heard the same. Now he was a very important figure in the government of President Correa, who was completely against the dollarization. And I have heard that they are recommending dollarization for Venezuela. I don't know. I am just repeating things I have heard. Maybe they are right, maybe they are wrong. I don't know. Second, you have to pay a price. We said that since the beginning. Nothing is free lunch. So, this is the basic question for exporters and for people in the private sector. You need to be competitive. how do you want to be competitive? One way is you can devalue, as you very well explained, Tony. The second is how much is your interest rate? What if you come to the international interest rate in your country? What about inflation? What if you come to the international inflation rate in your country? Why, if you can think like an entrepreneur in the United States, they are not thinking about devaluation, they are thinking about a stable economy. Why don't you plan like entrepreneurs in developed countries? And we believed in the capacity of the private sector of Ecuador. Completely. That was a matter of faith. You will have to face many problems, but you will be able to overcome them. To give you just one example, flowers were an important product of export for the Sierra in Ecuador, not for the country as such, less than 10% at that time. How do you calculate your production costs? By hectares. With the dollar, you have to be much more productive. They started calculating the cost by a square meter. And now, some people are calculating the cost by plant. You see, how can you improve your situation? This sounds like the developed world. Another example, shrimps in the coastal areas. The main exporter of shrimps, and the biggest in the world, we are the first exporters in the world, and this firm is the biggest in the world. The leader of that company made a very interesting and intelligent analysis and decision. Our farms, shrimp farms, were affected by the white spot that was killing the shrimps. While most of them were saying, how can we protect the shrimps from dying? What kind of antibiotics, etc., we have to put there to avoid the death rate? He discovered a different thing. He said like 10% of the shrimps are not dying. Why? Why they are not dying? And he discovered a genetic factor. So he decided to promote the growth of this kind of 10%. And he grew exponentially, and he doesn't use antibiotics. It's more natural, and he's great. Look how, again, talking about leadership, how shifting your paradigm, thinking in a different way, going against the current can offer you a lot of opportunities. So that's how you can do things. You need to be competitive in different ways. Nobody will give you as a gift anything, but you have to find better ways than the previous ones.
One concluding question?
Yes. Hello, my name is Ishmael. I would like to ask you, you talk about populism and leadership and such, and that some leaders in Latin America tend to create scapegoats in the society. You said that they say the division between societies, the class struggle of rich people against poor people, etc. But you also said that the problem might be different, might be more of a systemic problem in the society itself. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. First, I love popular leaders. I believe they are essential for democracy. A popular leader is not a populist leader. Thank you for the question, because it allows me to make that distinction. A popular leader does right things from a technical point of view in ways that the population appreciate that and support that. the populist leader does wrong things just to get the applause of the population. And you pay for that. Second, I think that inequality is a big problem in Latin America. We used to be the most unequal continent in the world. Not the poorest, but the most unequal. So, how do you think about that? Do you think it is fair, that society that we have now? Do you think that this is just a cost of growth, or do you think that is a problem? When you come to office, to any office, private or public, you come with two bags the first day in office. One bag says landscape, the other bag says problems. And you have all the issues on the table. And then you pick one issue. Let's say poverty. In which bag do you put it? Is that just part of the landscape? Because there were poor before, there will be poor after? Or you put in the bag of problems? Peru, in the case of Ecuador, is a problem or just landscape? Corruption, problem or landscape? And then when you get the bag with problems, you have an agenda, and you have a plan. And in good democracies, you elect the people based on the agendas. You compare them and you vote for that is closest to your way of thinking. So I think what happens in societies has a lot of problems based on the way you structure the laws, the economic organization, the social situation, etc. And I think that democracy is based in three things. And the best definition I have found is Abraham Lincoln Gettysburg Address. Is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Meaning of the people, elections. You have to be there because somebody voted you. You are not a dictator of the people. By the people give you a constitution and a set of laws that you have to respect. And third, for the people. What is the final result? Who get the benefits of democracy? When you have the three, you have legitimacy of origin, you are elected, legitimacy of practice, you govern democratically, and legitimacy of results. You're improving the quality of life of the majority of your people. Many times, we pay a lot of attention to the first one. And you say, we have people voting, you have democracy. Just a minute. Or sometimes you elect somebody that once in power, just go against all the laws and the Constitution, and he calls or she calls herself or himself democratic. But the worst is the third one. If you are not improving the quality of life of the people in general, why they will support democracy? Why? What is in there for them? That's a rational, fair question, I think. So that's where I think we have to work.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we conclude, just a couple of things. First one is, I know we're over time, but in 2 minutes or less, if you can answer this question that I ask all our guests. We have a lot of young people here. Tons of students have come to see you. And I'm sure some of these students, as many other students around the nation, around the world, would like to be, if not presidents, public servants. But they watch the news, they read what's going on, and they're turned off by the bickering and the fighting and the corruption and the scandals, and they don't enter public service because of all the negativity. What do you tell a young person, one of the ones here, who wants to be a public servant, but is turned off by what they see and what they hear? Why should they be a public servant?
Okay, first I would say to anybody, ask the two most important questions in your life. Who am I? And what do I live for? The rest are details. If you don't have the two questions clearly answered for yourself. And nobody can give you that answer. You have to find it in your own way. And maybe you have to travel your own journey to find the solution, the answer. So, second, be loyal to yourself. If you find that public service is your calling, go there. Because politics is not different from any other human activity. We are human beings doing human things. The difference is that you have the spotlight next to you the whole time. And you have good people, bad people, corrupt people, etc. Third, if you want to change a society, politics is the best way to do it. Because your decisions affect so many millions, different from the private practice of any other profession. You're helping one by one or groups. Politics allows you to influence the whole society. 4, never confuse yourself with your role. You are not what you do. If you are blessed, you can find something to do in life that represents your values, and you are happy doing it. The opposite, somebody that every single day is saying, how many more years I will have to perform this duty because I have to pay a mortgage. So find your calling, follow your heart, dedicate yourself to that. And finally, a beautiful distinction I found in President Havel from Czechoslovakia. What is the difference between optimism and hope? The optimist thinks that everything will be okay. The person that has hope thinks that everything that happens makes sense. So you can learn from the experience.
Speaking of learning, you mentioned your class at Harvard. We met at Harvard over 20 years ago, and I can attest to the quality of your class. So FIU students are going to get to experience that because this is the first announcement. The president has kindly accepted our offer to have him be a senior leadership fellow. So he'll be teaching, not this semester, but we're still trying to figure out when, but he'll be a senior leadership fellow, so you'll be able to experience all the lessons that you have heard and that are in the book. Coming up soon, we'll let you know when. And speaking of the books have arrived, so if you're an FIU student, we have a book for you if you're interested, so come after the event and the president can sign it for you.
Happily.
So,
Yeah.
Tony, thank you for joining us, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.